Welcome to the Midnight Historian, a place where ancient tales unfold in hushed tones and history drifts gently into the silence of night. Close your eyes, let the past guide you into peace as we journey through forgotten stories softly told to bring you deep rest, reflection, and a serene night's sleep. This is not just history, it's history whispered into dreams. Before we begin, please consider subscribing and leave a like and a gentle comment. It helps these peaceful tales reach others who need rest. Now let's begin. As the world outside settles into the quiet embrace of night, let us gently turn the pages of history back to a time when life moved to a different rhythm, a rhythm dictated by the sun's journey, the turning of the seasons, and the deep-rooted echoes of tradition. We journey to the year 1100, a period often called the High Middle Ages, to explore the intricate ways in which women's lives were shaped by the institution of marriage. This was a world where futures were not always imagined with dreams of love, but often priced out in bolts of cloth and chickens, or secured through the strategic exchange of land and titles. As we delve into this distant past, allow the factual tapestry of these lives to unfold, calmly and descriptively, painting a vivid picture of a world both familiar and profoundly alien. Imagine, if you will, the air of a medieval settlement in the year 1100. It was a complex tapestry of aromas, constantly shifting with the time of day, the season, and the specific activities unfolding within its bounds. In the low-lit, smoky interior of a typical medieval hall, the air carried a unique stew of aromas. There was the earthy scent of stale rushes, often mixed with fresh ones, covering the floor, absorbing spills and providing a modicum of warmth. The dampness of a hearth, where a fire perpetually smouldered, mingled with the faint metallic tang of sweat from bodies engaged in negotiation or labour. Perhaps, too, a subtle hint of boiled turnip or simmering stew would waft from the kitchen, a promise of the next meal. Beyond the immediate confines of a home, the pervasive smell of wood smoke clung to clothing, a natural, albeit involuntary, perfume for many, signalling the constant need for warmth and cooking. In the bustling towns, the olfactory experience could be overwhelming, a dense fog of competing odours. The narrow, unpaved streets often bore the pungent stench of slaughtered animals from the butcher's stalls, where blood and offal were disposed of with rudimentary methods. Overflowing latrines, often little more than pits or simple privies, added their noxious contribution to the air, particularly during warmer months. Various trades, essential to urban life, also emitted powerful and often unpleasant odours. Tanners, for instance, were notorious for their use of urine, dog excrement, and stale beer in their processes, creating a truly powerful and unpleasant odour that permeated their neighbourhoods, making them easily identifiable even from a distance. Despite these pervasive and often apocalyptic stenches, medieval people were not desensitised to them. They were acutely aware of the foul air, often associating it with disease and moral decay. Yet, efforts were made to mitigate these unpleasantries, particularly among those who could afford it. Floors were strewn with fresh, dried herbs like thyme and rose petals, their gentle fragrances released with every step, offering a brief respite from the heavier odours. Homes were regularly aired out to dispel what was believed to be miasma, bad air thought to transmit illness. For personal hygiene, rudimentary but often pleasant, scented washes for the face and hair were used, often infused with rosewater or other floral essences. Powders made from ground rice, orris root, a violet-scented plant, cloves or lavender were applied to the body, offering a subtle, sweet fragrance. Perfumes, though rudimentary by modern standards, were also employed, concocted from exotic and costly ingredients like ambergris, a waxy substance from sperm whales, civet, a secretion from wildcats, and musk from deer. These precious scents were not merely for personal pleasure, but served as a direct indicator of social standing and wealth. The ability to afford and use such fragrant materials was a clear marker of distinction, visibly contrasting with the pervasive, less pleasant odours of daily life for the majority of the population. This pervasive use of scent, both natural and artificial, elevated smell from a mere sensory detail to a form of social currency, demonstrating one's status and control over their immediate environment. The medieval world was a vibrant soundscape, constantly alive with the rhythms of daily life and the pronouncements of community. The clanging of bells was a ubiquitous sound, a constant presence that marked the passage of time and the unfolding of communal life. Church bells, in particular, were not only rung to announce holy days but also to signal significant community events, including the joyous, or sometimes solemn, announcement of marriage intentions. These bells served as a communal clock and calendar, structuring the day from the first light of dawn mass to the final evening prayers, guiding the lives of villagers and townspeople alike. In the bustling towns one would hear the echoes of distant persons, their voices carrying through the narrow streets, mingling with the insistent shouting of street vendors, hawking their wares: fresh fish, hot pies, good ale. The rattling of iron chains from various workshops, perhaps from a smithy or a cooper, would punctuate the air, alongside the constant hammering of the blacksmith shaping metal, a rhythmic beat of industry. These urban noises painted a vivid picture of industrious activity and crowded living, a constant hum of human endeavour. On farms, the sounds were more organic, attuned to the natural world. The cackling chicken, announcing a fresh egg, the gentle mowing of sheep as they grazed, the rhythmic noise of trotting horse hooves on a dirt path, and the steady thud of an axe chopping wood, preparing for the evening fire. The creak of old wooden doors opening and closing, and the distant murmur of human voices, all contributed to a rich, immersive auditory experience, a constant reminder of life unfolding. These sounds were far more than mere background noise. They served as a vital chronometer and community announcer. The bells, in particular, structured the collective day and publicly marked significant life events like marriages, ensuring that the entire community was aware of these transitions. This constant auditory signal reinforced community cohesion and a collective awareness of individual milestones, particularly important in a largely illiterate society where written announcements were rare. The soundscape was a continuous, pervasive reminder of social order, religious observance, and the interconnectedness of lives within the village or town. Life in 1100 was a profoundly tactile experience, where the materials of daily existence directly conveyed social status and the realities of labour. The feel of damp wool against the skin was common for many, as wool was the most prevalent fabric, often worn close to the body, absorbing moisture and retaining warmth. The cold, hard stone of church floors was a familiar sensation underfoot, particularly during long hours of prayer or ceremony. Peasant homes typically had earthen floors, packed earth that could be damp and uneven, providing little comfort. In stark contrast, wealthier homes might feature stone floors, though even these offered a stark, unyielding surface, often covered with rushes or rudimentary mats for warmth. Clothing, the most immediate layer of interaction with the world, varied dramatically by class. For the vast majority, garments were made of coarse wool or linen, spun and woven by hand. These fabrics were hard-wearing and practical, but often itchy, rough against the skin, and difficult to clean, requiring laborious washing in rivers or troughs. Peasants usually owned only one or two main outfits, which were meticulously mended and patched for years, passed down through generations until they were threadbare. In stark contrast, noble women wore luxurious fabrics like silk, satin, and velvet, imported from distant lands and dyed in vibrant, costly colours. These garments were often adorned with intricate embroidery, shimmering gold thread, or lustrous pearls, catching the light and proclaiming their wearer's status. Their cloaks might be lined with expensive furs like vair, the soft grey and white fur of a squirrel, providing both warmth against the chill of draughty castles and an unmistakable symbol of wealth and social standing. Household objects were predominantly crafted from readily available natural materials, reflecting the local resources and the ingenuity of artisans. Wood was fundamental, used for almost everything: sturdy furniture like benches, simple tables and chests for storing possessions. Spoons and bowls, often carved with simple designs, were also made from wood, worn smooth by countless meals. Horn and bone, by products of animal husbandry, were versatile materials for items like drinking vessels, knife handles and combs, showcasing a resourceful use of every part of an animal. Metal pots and ironware were also present, particularly for cooking over open fires. though often harder to acquire locally for peasants, making them valuable possessions. For the nobility, castles were adorned with large, intricate tapestries, which not only depicted scenes of chivalry, hunting, or religious stories, but also served a practical purpose in insulating drafty stone walls, adding warmth and beauty to otherwise stark interiors. The textures and materials of daily life were not merely functional, they were deeply symbolic of one's place in the social hierarchy. For peasants, the rough wool, earthen floors, and shared living spaces with animals underscored a life of constant physical labour and limited comfort, a constant reminder of their intimate connection to the land and its demands. These material realities directly shaped their daily comfort, health, and social interactions, defining their very existence. For nobles, the soft silks, luxurious furs, and decorative tapestries served as a constant tactile reminder of their elevated status, their detachment from manual labour, and their access to exotic goods. This pervasive materiality meant that class distinctions were not just abstract concepts, but were palpable through touch, sight, and the very feel of one's surroundings, reinforcing the rigid social order of the time. In 1100, Western European society was fundamentally agrarian and rigidly hierarchical, structured by the feudal system. This system was a complex web of reciprocal obligations, where land was exchanged for service and loyalty. At the top were the monarchs, followed by powerful lords and bishops, then knights, and finally, the vast majority of the population, the peasants. These peasants, often serfs, lived in villages and worked the land, tied to their noble overlords, providing labour, goods, and military service in exchange for protection and the right to cultivate a plot of land. Towns were growing, often around castles or trade routes, providing centres for merchants and artisans, but they were crowded, noisy, and often unsanitary, a stark contrast to the slower pace of rural life. Within this stratified society, women, regardless of their social class, were generally subordinate to men. Their lives were largely defined by their roles within the household and, most critically, their capacity for procreation. Their primary responsibility was to ensure the smooth running of the household, whether it was a grand castle or a humble hut, and to bear children. This expectation was not merely a social norm, but a fundamental economic and political imperative. The expectation of childbearing was not just a societal preference, but a fundamental economic and political imperative in 1100. For noble women, producing legitimate heirs was crucial for securing dynastic continuity, maintaining power, and solidifying alliances between powerful families and kingdoms. Without heirs, a family line could face extinction, leading to political instability, the fragmentation of lands, or even civil war as rivals vied for control. The very survival of a noble house depended on the successful production of a male heir. For peasant women, children represented future labour for the farm and household, essential for the family's survival and long-term security. More hands meant more crops harvested, more animals tended, and a greater chance of enduring the harsh realities of medieval life. This universal pressure meant that a woman's value and her life's trajectory were intrinsically tied to her fertility from a very young age. This expectation influenced everything from her physical appearance, which was often assessed for signs of health and reproductive capability. A robust physique, clear eyes, and a generally healthy demeanour were seen as indicators of fertility, to her daily routines, which were structured around the demands of child rearing and household management, even before she became a mother. Her life was, in many ways, a preparation for motherhood. In the year 1100, marriage was rarely a matter of romantic love, as we understand it today. Instead, it was fundamentally a strategic contract, a binding agreement designed to serve the interests of families, lineages, and even kingdoms. The primary purposes of marriage were pragmatic: to produce legitimate heirs to continue the family line, to build and strengthen political alliances between powerful families or even rival nations, to protect or expand territorial holdings, and to increase overall wealth or power through the merging of estates or the acquisition of valuable dowries. These motivations applied across all social classes, though the specific stakes and the scale of the implications varied greatly between the nobility and the peasantry. For a noble family, a marriage could avert war or secure a vital border. For a peasant family, it could mean the difference between starvation and a slightly more secure harvest. The church, a dominant force in medieval society, played an increasingly significant role in shaping marriage law during the 11th and 12th centuries. This period saw the foundations of canon law on marriage firmly laid, particularly influenced by the Gregorian reforms, which sought to purify and centralize the church's authority. The church asserted its judicial authority over marriage, aiming to implant the doctrine of marital indissolubility. The idea that a valid marriage could not be dissolved, and to diminish the ability of family and kin to control marriage independently, without ecclesiastical oversight. This included restricting clerical marriage and defining the concept of consent, which, in theory, granted individuals more autonomy in choosing a spouse. However, the Church's evolving role was not without its complexities and clashes with secular powers. While it emphasized the importance of free consent, it also sought to standardize and control the sacrament of marriage, sometimes leading to conflicts with feudal lords who wished to maintain their traditional control over marital alliances for political and economic gain. The 11th century was a pivotal period where the Church actively worked to centralize and standardize marriage law, shifting it from a purely familial or secular affair to a sacrament under ecclesiastical jurisdiction. This was a gradual process, and the tension between church ideals, such as spiritual purity and individual consent, and societal realities, such as arranged marriages and political necessity, would persist for centuries. The Church's power to issue dispensations for certain unions, for example, to allow marriage between distant cousins who would otherwise be too closely related by canon law, or to grant annulments, became a key tool in this ongoing power struggle, often providing a loophole for the elite, while simultaneously reinforcing the Church's own authority and influence over the lives of its adherents. This complex interplay of spiritual doctrine and worldly power made marriage a truly foundational institution in medieval society. For the noblewoman of 1100, life was often a tightly controlled performance, where her very existence was interwoven with the grand strategies of her family. Her marriage was not a personal narrative, but a strategic move on a vast diplomatic chessboard, intricately woven with threads of velvet and stitched with land rights. Her future was laid out before her, often without her direct input, a path determined by the needs and ambitions of her lineage. The future of a noble daughter was rarely her own to shape. Indeed, it was often decided before she could even walk or speak. Marriage arrangements among powerful families were frequently planned generations in advance, meticulously mapped across parchments by men with ink-stained fingers and long memories, their minds focused on alliances, territories, and the continuation of their bloodlines. A daughter's name was not merely her identity, it was a valuable tool, a crucial thread in a complex web of fealty, alliance, or even revenge. Her fate might have been discussed in drawing rooms months, if not years, before her birth, or even decided when she was still in her cradle, a tiny, unwitting pawn in a grand game of political chess. Betrothal, the formal promise to marry, could occur at incredibly young ages, sometimes even in infancy. Historical records indicate that some royal marriages were arranged when the bride was as young as 3 months old, a testament to the urgency and long-term planning involved in securing powerful alliances. While canon law, which was still developing its authority in the 11th century, set the legal minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, noble girls were frequently betrothed much younger. Examples from the broader medieval period, with some direct 11th century relevance, show betrothals at ages as low as 1, 2, 5, or 8 years old. These were not marriages in the sense of shared lives, but rather unbreakable contracts, often sealed with elaborate ceremonies, to ensure future political stability. Consider these specific examples from the 11th century, which illustrate the practice of early betrothal and marriage among the European nobility. Hedwig of France, at approximately 13 years of age, was married to Renaud, Count of Nevers, in 1016. This union was a strategic move to solidify ties between the Capetian dynasty and a powerful regional count. Adela of Normandy, a daughter of William the Conqueror, around her 15th birthday, married the future Stephen, Count of Blois, who was aged 35. 38 between 1080 and 1083. This marriage was a cornerstone of Norman expansionist policy, linking the powerful Norman ducal family with an influential French count. Gisela of Burgundy, at 14 or 15, married Humbert II, Count of Savoy, aged 24 or 25, in 1090. Such marriages were vital for maintaining influence and control over Alpine passes and trade routes. Constance of France, aged between 15 and 17, married Hugh Vows, Count of Troyes, aged 19 to 21, between 1093 and 1095. This alliance further strengthened the Capetian network of loyal vassals. Alfonso VI of Galicia and Leon was betrothed to Adeliza, another daughter of William the Conqueror and Matilda of Flanders, before 1074, though Adeliza tragically died before the marriage could be consummated, highlighting the fragility of these arrangements. Even when the formal marriage ceremony took place at a young age, the actual consummation of the marriage was often postponed until both partners reached a more mature age, typically around 16 for girls. This practice highlights a complex interplay of legal, social, and biological realities. Early betrothals were a tool to secure political and economic advantages for families long before the individuals involved were physically or socially ready for marital life. The delay in consummation, while practical for the bride's physical development and safety in childbirth, also meant that the marriage was, for many years, purely a contractual and symbolic arrangement between powerful families, not a lived reality for the young couple. This distinct separation between the legal and political binding of the union and its eventual physical and emotional realization underscores the fundamentally transactional nature of noble marriages in the 11th century. The young noblewoman was a living treaty, a guarantee of future cooperation. Her personal feelings a secondary, often irrelevant, consideration. For noble families in 1100, dowries were not merely customary, they were essential, functioning as comprehensive medieval starter kits for brides, meticulously assembled to ensure the success and stability of the new union. These were packages of significant value designed to sweeten the deal, facilitate alliances, and assure all parties that the bride would not arrive empty-handed. For nobles, dowries were often vast, comprising not just money, but also substantial landholdings, which provided income and influence, a significant number of livestock, and a wide array of movable goods, from household furnishings to personal adornments. The contents of a noble dowry were rarely romantic. They were intensely practical and symbolic of wealth and status. Typical items might include large quantities of pewter plates, gleaming dully in the light, sturdy kettles for the kitchen, side tables, even those with a slightly broken leg, perhaps a testament to their journey, and sets of combs made from carved bone or ivory for personal grooming. Beyond these basic necessities, dowries for noble women were packed with movable goods that flaunted her family's wealth and smoothed the establishment of her new household. This could include luxurious silk or velvet gowns, often embroidered with shimmering gold thread or lustrous pearls, much like Eleanor of Provence's legendary wardrobe of Samite cloaks and wool gowns designed to impress and signify status. Jewellery was a standard inclusion: heavy gold necklaces, gem-studded brooches that caught the light, or rings, sometimes engraved with family crests, serving both as status symbols and as a form of portable wealth that could be pawned in times of need. High-bred horses, complete with finely crafted saddles and elaborate caparisons, fancy horse blankets adorned with heraldry, were often part of the dowry, especially if the groom was a knight, providing both transport and a symbol of martial prowess. Household items like gleaming silver plate cups, dishes and serving platters, and fine linens, bedding, tablecloths, and decorative tapestries were common to furnish her new life with elegance and comfort. While rare, even pieces of art like painted panels or reliquaries, containers for holy relics, might be included if the family was particularly pious or artistic, adding a spiritual or cultural dimension to the material wealth. The dowry ultimately became the property of the groom's family, a permanent transfer of assets. However, the financial arrangements extended beyond the dowry. A dower was also a crucial provision, granted by the groom's family to the bride for her support should she become a widow. This dower was typically a portion of the husband's possessions at the time of the wedding, often 1/3 of his land, which she would hold for her lifetime or until she remarried. This land provided her with an income and a place to live, ensuring her financial security and preventing her from becoming a burden on her birth family or the lord. These two financial instruments, the dowry and the dower, represent a sophisticated economic system designed to manage wealth transfer and ensure stability across generations in a patriarchal society. The dowry was the bride's family's significant investment in the new alliance, serving as a form of pre-mortem inheritance for the daughter, a tangible contribution to the new household, demonstrating the bride's family's commitment and financial standing. The dower, conversely, was the husband's family's provision for the wife's future, particularly crucial if she became a widow, offering a degree of financial security in a world where a married woman's legal rights over property were often limited during her husband's lifetime. The intricate interplay between dowry and dower highlights how deeply economic considerations underpinned the social fabric of medieval marriage, often dictating the terms of a girl's life long before she ever stood beside a church altar. It was a complex dance of assets, ensuring that both families had a vested interest in the success and stability of the union. The marriage of a noble girl often necessitated a journey across vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, to a man whose only claim to familiarity was his crest on a tapestry or a fleeting rumour. These journeys were far from leisurely. They were ceremonial but fraught with peril, a test of endurance and composure, a physical manifestation of the transition from one life to another. Servants meticulously packed trunks with gowns and cloths, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. A detailed dowry list, often several pages long, was read aloud and signed by notaries and uncles, marking the formal transfer of value and responsibility. Travel in 1100 was inherently dangerous and challenging. Roads were often in terrible condition, little more than ancient tracks, easily turning into impassable muddy rivers after prolonged rain, and frequently blocked by fallen trees or landslides. Bandits, often disgruntled soldiers left without trade during lulls in conflicts, were a common and serious hazard, preying on travellers and their valuable possessions. Noble brides, representing significant familial and political investments, travelled with substantial retinues of ladies in waiting, who provided companionship and assistance, and heavily armed escorts of knights and men-at-arms to ensure their safety from both human and natural threats. Conveyances were typically horses. For the most elite, rare passenger carriages might be used, though these were exceptionally uncommon, often little more than carts with rudimentary suspension, offering a bumpy and uncomfortable ride. Journeys could last for days or even weeks, depending on the distance and the terrain. Accounts exist of noble brides arriving at their new homes, suffering from frostbite and swollen feet due to a combination of ill-fitting boots, inadequate protection from the elements, and the relentless cold of winter travel. Upon arrival, the challenges for a foreign bride intensified. She might find herself unable to speak the local language or dialect, her words met with blank stares or polite confusion. She would be unfamiliar with the customs of her new household, perhaps unknowingly committing social faux pas. Her very appearance might mark her as an outsider. Her hair might be braided differently, her clothing foreign in cut or fabric, and even her posture or way of carrying herself could distinguish her. Integration was rarely immediate or gentle. She would be subjected to constant scrutiny, with servants gossiping in hushed tones and courtiers observing her every move, judging her suitability for her new role. She might be mocked for her accent, corrected on her curtsies, or scolded for walking alone, a sign of impropriety. This arduous journey was far more than a simple logistical transfer. It was a profound rite of passage that tested a noble woman's resilience and capacity for adaptation. Stripped of her familiar environment and support system, she was immediately thrust into a new, often bewildering and potentially hostile, cultural landscape where every gesture was scrutinized. Her ability to adapt quietly and produce heirs efficiently was paramount, as her success in these areas directly impacted the stability and prestige of the alliance her marriage was meant to secure. The journey, therefore, was not merely a prelude to marriage, but the first, and often most challenging, test of her capacity to embody her new role as a diplomatic asset, a living symbol of her family's power and ambition. Her personal feelings were secondary to the success of the union, and she was expected to bear the burden of adaptation with grace and fortitude. In the 11th century, the practicalities of long-distance travel, ongoing wars, and complex political negotiations often made the physical presence of both the bride and groom at the wedding ceremony impractical or even impossible. In such cases, marriage by proxy was not unusual, particularly among noble families, where strategic alliances often spanned vast geographical distances. This arrangement allowed the strategic alliance to proceed without delay, even if the intended groom was abroad fighting in a distant land, negotiating a treaty, or simply avoiding the ceremony due to other pressing duties. In a proxy marriage, a stand-in, often another nobleman, a trusted family member, or a high-ranking cleric, would take the groom's place at the altar, reciting vows on his behalf. The ceremony would proceed as if the true groom were present, with all the solemnity and legal weight. The bride's response, when it came, was not always entirely her own, as she was expected to accept the match, her consent a formality in a union already decided. The proxy might wear a ring on the absent groom's behalf, bow politely, or offer a symbolic gesture, such as placing his foot in the bride's shoe, to signify the transfer of authority and possession. But the legal bond was considered fully sealed between the bride and the real absent groom, making the union binding from that moment. This legal binding was crucial. It prevented either party from fleeing the altar and offered a layer of protection for the bride during her often dangerous travels to her new home, as she was now officially married and under the protection of her new husband's family. For many brides, their first glimpse of their husband came weeks or even months after the marriage had taken place, sometimes through a carefully painted portrait commissioned to give her a likeness of her future spouse. The accuracy of these portraits varied wildly. Some were flattering, others imaginative, leading to potential shock or disappointment upon meeting the actual person. One Italian noblewoman, for example, reportedly fainted upon meeting her husband, having expected a man with auburn hair and soft eyes, and finding instead a bald knight with a prominent scar across his cheek and a tendency to shout commands rather than gentle words. Such encounters underscore the profound disconnect between the formal contract and the lived reality of these marriages. The prevalence of proxy marriages highlights how the legal and political functions of marriage profoundly superseded any personal connection in 11th century noble society. The transaction of the marriage was paramount, effectively reducing the bride to a contractual object whose physical presence was secondary to the legal bond established. This created a surreal and often emotionally distant entry into marriage for many noble women, forcing them to adapt to a life with a stranger whose reality might differ vastly from any preconceived notions or painted likenesses. The fact that the legal bond had already been sealed and the girl was already a wife, before any genuine personal interaction, underscores the profound lack of agency experienced by these women, whose futures were decided and formalized without their direct participation. They were, in essence, married to a name and a lineage before they ever met the man himself. Far from the grand halls and intricate political manoeuvres of castles, the peasant woman's life in 1100 was shaped by the immediate rhythms of the earth and the constant, tangible needs of survival. Her marriage, too, was a practical affair, a negotiation of necessities, yet no less vital in the quiet, enduring tapestry of her village life. Her days were marked by the sun's arc and the demands of the land, her future bound to the soil and the strength of her hands. In the rural communities of 1100, marriages were not announced by heralds or debated in formal drawing rooms. Instead, they were arranged in quiet negotiations, often taking place over mugs of lukewarm ale and half-eaten loaves of rye bread, the conversation drifting casually from discussions of livestock, the recent rainfall, and the state of the harvest, to the far more consequential territory of a daughter's future. These matches were fundamentally pragmatic, driven by the immediate economic realities of who had grain in their granary, who had a healthy flock of goats, and who had too many mouths to feed from a meagre plot of land. A marriage could solve a multitude of problems before they fully materialized. A family with too many sons might marry one off to ease the burden on the farm, sending him to work on another's land or to join a new household, thus reducing the number of mouths to feed from their own limited resources. Conversely, a family with too few daughters might seek one from a neighbouring lane to help with the endless tasks of cooking barley, churning butter, spinning wool, and tending to the household. These arrangements, while seemingly heartless from a modern perspective, were born of seasonal necessity and the constant, pressing need for security in a world where few things were certain, where a bad harvest could mean starvation and illness could decimate a family. A good marriage deal was as close to security as one could hope for when the house leaked, the cow limped, and the thatch needed replacing before winter's biting winds arrived. Peasant women generally married at slightly older ages than their noble counterparts, typically in their late teens or early 20s, with estimates ranging from 18 to 25 years old. This later marriage age was often a direct consequence of a period known as life cycle servanthood. During this time, young people, both male and female, would leave their parents' households to gain experience in the world and earn their own money, often working as servants in wealthier peasant homes or in the households of minor gentry. Girls and women often worked as household servants, learning essential tasks necessary for a wife, such as spinning, weaving, managing domestic affairs, cooking, and preserving food. This period allowed them to accumulate some personal resources, perhaps a small hoard of coins or a few pieces of linen, and to gain valuable practical skills. This extended period of semi-independence meant that by the time they married, peasant women had accumulated some personal resources and valuable skills that made them desirable partners. This highlights economic prudence as the primary driver of peasant marriage age. Unlike noble marriages, which were often arranged for dynastic politics from infancy, peasant marriages were largely delayed until the individuals, particularly the woman, had acquired enough personal capital and practical abilities to contribute meaningfully to a new household. This reflects a fundamental economic reality. A new household needed two capable, contributing adults to survive and thrive. The later marriage age for peasants was thus a pragmatic economic strategy, ensuring the viability and stability of the new family unit, rather than being primarily a matter of personal choice or romantic inclination. It was about building a sustainable future, one thread at a time. For peasant families, the dowry, while essential, was often a source of considerable stress and exhaustion, requiring years of careful saving and diligent labour. Unlike the vast landholdings and luxurious goods of noble dowries, peasant dowries were typically modest, consisting of practical items necessary for establishing a new home and contributing to the household economy. A typical dowry might include functional livestock, such as a few hens for eggs, a goose for meat and feathers, or a goat for milk, all vital for sustenance. Some linen sheets, perhaps hand-spun and woven by the bride herself, and basic kitchenware, such as a wooden bowl or a simple metal pot, would also be included. Sometimes, a symbolic trinket like a carved spoon or a single cherry stone might be included for luck or to mark the bride's uniqueness, a small personal touch in a world of practicality. Crucially, for peasant women, her skills were as much a part of her dowry as any material possessions. During marriage negotiations, her family would highlight her domestic and agricultural abilities, emphasizing her competence and industriousness. She can churn butter with a strong arm, she is quiet and obedient, she sings psalms without complaint while she works, and her hands are skilled at mending. This emphasis on practical competence stands in stark contrast to the noble dowry, which focused on inherited wealth and luxury items. The peasant bride's value was in her capacity for labour and her ability to contribute directly to the household survival. Peasant women were deeply involved in the production of household goods, a relentless and essential part of their daily lives. They spun wool from their sheep and wove cloth on their looms to make their families' clothing, a labour-intensive but essential task that ensured warmth and modesty. Their dowry items were often practical, handmade, and directly reflected their domestic skills and resourcefulness, a tangible testament to their industriousness. These items were not merely possessions, they were tangible evidence of the bride's ability to contribute to the new household's self-sufficiency and survival, a clear demonstration of her worth as a partner. This highlights that for peasant women, the dowry was less about inherited wealth or political leverage and more about demonstrating her immediate and future economic value through her labour and practical skills. The fullness of her dowry and the thickness of her cloak hems were direct indicators of her capacity to contribute to the family's survival, a visual representation of her industriousness and preparation for married life. This fundamental difference in the currency of marriage across social classes underscores the distinct economic realities of medieval life. For peasants, it was human capital and practical goods. For nobles, it was inherited capital and political influence. Each class sought to maximize its advantage within its own sphere of influence, using marriage as a tool for stability and advancement. Life in a medieval peasant hamlet was characterized by constant labor and a close, often uncomfortable, proximity to the elements and livestock. Peasant homes were small, typically consisting of just one room, constructed from wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches and mud, with thatch roofs and no windows, allowing light only through the door or the smoke hole. A significant portion of the hut, often 1/3, was penned off for animals: a cow, a pig, a few chickens, meaning livestock shared the living space with the family, providing warmth in winter but also odours and pests. The air inside was perpetually smoky from the central hearth, which served for both heating and cooking, stinging the eyes but providing essential warmth. The daily life of a peasant woman was arduous, a relentless cycle of tasks that began before dawn and often ended after dusk. In the summer months, she might rise as early as 3 a.m., roused by the first chirping of birds. Her first task was typically to prepare breakfast, usually a simple pottage made from boiled grains, designed to provide sustenance for a day of hard labour. Throughout the day, she was responsible for a wide array of chores, tending to small animals like geese and chickens, ensuring they were fed and watered, working in the fields during busy times like harvest, bending her back alongside the men to bring in the crops, spinning wool and weaving cloth, the rhythmic hum of the spindle a constant companion, preparing rushes for lighting, dipping them in animal fat to create rudimentary candles, making preserves from seasonal fruits and vegetables to last through the lean winter months, tending the small vegetable plot outside her home, coaxing sustenance from the earth, collecting berries and herbs from the surrounding woods for food and medicine, and, crucially, caring for the children, nurturing the next generation. Her work often continued until dusk, meaning longer hours in summer, and she typically ate only after her husband and children had finished their meals, leaving her with very little leisure time, her days a blur of ceaseless activity. The peasant diet was basic but designed to provide the necessary calories for hard physical labour. It primarily consisted of cereals like rye, oats, and barley, used to make dense, dark bread, thick porridge, and thin gruel, forming the bulk of their meals. This was supplemented by fava beans and root vegetables, such as cabbage and leek, often grown in small gardens near their homes, providing essential nutrients. Meat was a rare luxury, usually limited to pork or chicken, often slaughtered and preserved by salting in autumn to last through the winter, a precious source of protein. Peasants typically drank ale or cider, brewed from grains or apples, with water rarely consumed due to concerns about its purity, making these fermented beverages safer and more common. Peasant clothing was practical and durable, made predominantly from rough wool or linen in muted, natural colours like brown, grey, yellow, and muted blues, as expensive dyes were unaffordable. They usually owned only 1 or 2 main garments, which were worn until they wore out, patched and repaired countless times, a testament to their longevity and the scarcity of new clothing. The peasant household in 1100 was a tightly integrated unit of production and consumption, where every member's labour was essential for survival. The intimate cohabitation with livestock and the pervasive smoke from the central hearth highlight a life lived in constant, physical engagement with their environment, a life of hard work and close community ties. For women, their daily existence was a relentless cycle of practical tasks, directly contributing to the family's sustenance and comfort. This constant, tangible connection to the necessities of life fostered a deep interdependence within the family and the broader community, where survival itself was a collective endeavour. This daily reality meant that marriage was not just a social contract, but a vital economic partnership where the combined efforts of husband and wife were crucial for enduring the harsh realities of medieval life, a shared struggle for existence. While the Church, from the 11th century onwards, increasingly asserted its authority over marriage law, aiming for standardization and control across Christendom in rural areas, the local priest often played a more practical and adaptable role. He might be consulted by a father not out of spiritual concern, but to ensure that a potential suitor for his daughter did not have an active feud with a neighbouring family, or that his family was not known for dishonesty or violence. This highlights how, at the local level, the Church's influence often intersected with, and sometimes adapted to, the immediate social and economic needs of the community, acting as a mediator and a source of local intelligence. Marriage ceremonies in villages were typically modest, a stark contrast to the lavish affairs of the nobility. They often involved a simple priest's blessing at the church door or even outside, a shared loaf of bread broken between the couple, and a cup of cider passed around, symbolising their new shared life. Before 1100 AD, many marriages did not even include a formal religious ceremony. A public announcement of intent, a kiss, and consummation were often considered sufficient, particularly among the poor, where formal ceremonies were an unaffordable luxury. This practice, known as hand-fasting, involved the tying of hands with ribbons and the exchange of rings, and did not necessarily require a priest's blessing, being more of a community-recognised agreement. The Church, however, increasingly insisted on public vows and a priest's blessing as the principal proof that a legal marriage had been contracted, seeking to bring all unions under its spiritual and legal authority. They also encouraged the publication of bans, public announcements of marriage intentions made in church on 3 successive Sundays, to ensure there were no impediments, such as pre-existing marriages or forbidden degrees of kinship. Yet, the enforcement of these rules was often uneven, particularly in remote villages or areas where the church's reach was less firm. Failure to obtain the nuptial blessing, to endow the bride in the face of the church, meaning publicly at the church door, or to publish the bans might render a marriage illicit, but not necessarily invalid. This meant the marriage would still stand, but the couple might face penances from the church, such as fasting or public confession, to atone for their transgression. This situation illustrates the pragmatic adaptation of church law to rural realities. While canonical consent was theoretically paramount, local customs and economic necessities often shaped the actual rituals and their perceived legitimacy within the community. The priest, rather than being a distant legal enforcer, frequently served as a central community figure, mediating disputes, gathering gossip, and lending legitimacy to unions that might otherwise fall outside strict canonical guidelines. This highlights a persistent tension between centralised religious authority and localised social practices, where the latter often adapted the former to fit their immediate needs and ensure social order. The Church's struggle to control where and how vows were made meant that, even in 1100, local traditions often held sway, reflecting the deep-seated customs of the people, a quiet resistance to overarching authority. The 11th century witnessed a significant shift in church law regarding marriage, particularly the increasing emphasis on individual consent as sufficient for a valid union. From the 11th and 12th centuries onwards, canon law, influenced by figures like Gratian, established that a marriage could be formed by the mutual consent of both parties, freely given, even without parental approval, witnesses, or a public ceremony. This progressive stance, which granted individuals more theoretical agency and a path to self-determination, inadvertently led to the rise of clandestine marriages, private, spontaneous verbal agreements exchanged in secret, often under the cloak of darkness or in secluded places. While technically binding in the eyes of the Church, these clandestine unions were considered illicit, forbidden, and posed significant practical and social problems. They made women particularly vulnerable to exploitation. A man could make false promises of marriage to gain sexual relations and later deny the union, leaving the woman disgraced, pregnant, and without recourse in a society that valued female chastity above all else. Without witnesses, such marriages were exceedingly difficult to prove in court, leading to lengthy and often inconclusive legal battles. If a legitimate secret marriage occurred, but one party later entered into a public marriage that could be proven, the public union would stand, condemning the person in the secret union to perpetual adultery and eternal damnation in the eyes of the church. Court records from the medieval period are filled with such cases, where individuals claimed vows spoken in barns, by wells, or in the woods, often with no one but the couple present, their words their only bond. The church attempted to counteract these issues by encouraging public vows, the presence of witnesses, and the publication of banns announcements of marriage intentions made in church. However, enforcement was uneven, and the rules were often distant in small villages or simply ignored in border regions where authority was weak. The desire for personal choice, or the need to escape an unwanted arranged marriage, often outweighed the risks. The unintended consequences of consent-based marriage law are evident in this period. The Church's progressive emphasis on individual consent, while a theoretical step towards greater autonomy, inadvertently created a legal and social quagmire. Without formal witnesses or public ceremony, a woman's consent could be easily denied or misinterpreted, leaving her reputation, social standing, and future precarious. This highlights how legal reforms, even those with good intentions, can have unforeseen and detrimental social consequences when not adequately supported by robust enforcement mechanisms or when they clash with deeply ingrained societal norms. The murkiness of these laws meant that, while love or personal choice could be spoken, its legal standing was often fragile, leaving individuals, particularly women, in a vulnerable and uncertain position, their lives hanging on a whispered word. Beneath the rigid structures of arranged marriages and the pervasive influence of economic and social necessity, the human heart in 1100 still stirred with desires for love and personal choice. These desires, though often suppressed, sometimes led to quiet acts of emotional resilience or, more dramatically, to perilous defiance against the established order, a testament to the enduring human spirit. In the medieval world, romantic affection was frequently regarded with suspicion, almost like a fever that might burn away reason, a dangerous emotion that could disrupt the carefully constructed order of society. For the powerful, love was seen as a distraction, a thing for troubadours and fools, something that could interfere with crucial land transfers, complicate inheritance, or undermine political alliances. Marriage, in this context, was unequivocally a contract, a binding of names and assets, not a union based on personal sentiment or fleeting emotion. Despite this prevailing transactional view, affection was not entirely absent from medieval lives. It found ways to bloom in quiet, often unacknowledged moments, like wildflowers pushing through cracks in stone. A mother might brush back a strand of her daughter's hair with a reassuring smile, a silent promise of support. An older cousin might sneak a knowing glance across a crowded hall, a shared understanding of unspoken thoughts. Or a whispered joke might be shared behind a raised goblet during a feast, a moment of shared levity in a formal world. These small acts of warmth and connection offered fleeting glimpses of human tenderness amidst the cold calculus of matrimonial arrangements, reminding individuals that warmth could still exist. Some couples, even after an arranged marriage, gradually grew fond of each other, developing shared jokes, private rituals, and comfortable rhythms in their daily lives, finding companionship and mutual respect where love was not initially sought. This affection, when it did develop, was often considered a blessing, like a warm spring after a harsh winter, a bonus rather than a prerequisite for the union. Among the lower classes, affection occasionally played a more discernible role in matchmaking, though still subservient to practical concerns. Peasant families might allow a daughter to marry a boy she fancied, provided his family had a decent patch of barley, no outstanding debts, and a good reputation for hard work. Young couples might be permitted to speak under supervision at village gatherings, dance at a fair, or exchange small tokens during harvest celebrations, allowing a tentative connection to form. Even so, the pervasive pressure to match strategically did not disappear. Survival needs often bulldozed personal preference, and a girl's opinion could be as easily ignored by a farmer as by a king, if the economic or social advantages of another match were too great to ignore. The heart's whisper was often drowned out by the rumbling of the stomach or the clink of coins. The persistence of human connection amidst transactional marriage reveals a powerful underlying human resilience. Despite the overwhelming emphasis on practical and economic considerations, the human need for emotional solace and companionship found ways to manifest. These quiet moments and slowly developing fondness were not central to the formal institution of marriage, but they were crucial for the individuals navigating it. They represented a subtle transformation of a practical arrangement into a lived relationship, however imperfect, demonstrating that even in the most constrained circumstances, people sought and found emotional connection, a small flame of warmth in a pragmatic world. Despite the immense weight of customs, contracts, and clerical oversight, some couples in 1100 still chose the perilous path of elopement, opting for flight over submission to an unwanted union. These desperate acts were driven by a variety of reasons. A girl promised to a man she feared or despised, a boy facing a future carved in someone else's handwriting, or a pair of friends who had whispered too many secrets and realized that marriage might be the only way to protect their bond and their future together. They would slip through the cracks in the system, riding at dawn under the cover of mist, hiding in barns by day, bribing ferrymen to cross rivers, or crossing into neighbouring parishes where names could be softened or changed, hoping to disappear into anonymity. The consequences of elopement were severe and far-reaching, a stark deterrent to such acts of defiance. A girl who ran away could destroy. The consequences of elopement were severe and far-reaching, a stark deterrent to such acts of defiance. A girl who ran away could destroy years of careful negotiation, leading to forfeited dowries, undone alliances, and a ruined family reputation that could last for generations. If the boy was caught, he could face brutal beatings, imprisonment, or even death, depending on his and the girl's social standing and the wrath of the offended families. A daughter who resisted her arranged match too loudly or too publicly could be labelled difficult, prideful, or even touched by the devil, undermining her marriageability. If she returned after a failed elopement, she might be locked away, shunned by the community, or married off even faster to ensure she would not attempt defiance again, her fate sealed with greater severity. Historical accounts provide glimpses of such bold flights, though often with tragic or complex outcomes. Gunhild, a daughter of Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, in the 1070s, eloped or was abducted from a monastery and married Count Alain of Brittany, defying the church's protection of monastic vows. Though Archbishop Anselm later attempted to persuade her to return to Wilton Abbey, she never did, and her marriage seemingly stood, a rare example of defiance succeeding. Another notable example is Bertrade of Montfort, born around 1070. She either abandoned her first husband, Fulk IV, Count of Anjou, or was abducted by King Philip V of France in 1092. She then bigamously married Philip, sparking one of the biggest sex scandals of the 11th century and leading to their excommunication by Pope Urban II. Despite the severe opposition, Bertrade was recognised as queen, and her excommunication was eventually lifted in 1104, demonstrating that even the church's authority could be challenged by powerful individuals. While many elopements ended in tragedy, with couples caught, punished, or forced to separate, some couples did succeed in finding a new life. They found sanctuary in sympathetic towns, built quiet lives under new names, and raised children who never knew the danger their parents once faced. Sometimes, elopement was not a romantic rebellion, but a desperate, practical measure, such as for a girl who became pregnant out of wedlock and sought to legitimize her child and avoid disgrace, her flight a desperate attempt to secure a future. Elopement, though rare and fraught with peril, represented a powerful, albeit often tragic, assertion of individual will against the collective interests of family and society in 1100. It highlights the extreme measures individuals might take when faced with intolerable arranged unions. A desperate gamble for personal freedom. The severe punishments meted out to those who defied the system underscore the societal imperative to maintain order and control over marital alliances, as such defiance was perceived as a direct threat to the very fabric of medieval power structures. Yet, the persistence of these stories, even in their tragic forms, speaks to an enduring human desire for self-determination in matters of the heart, a quiet whisper of rebellion in a world full of commands. For medieval women in 1100, marriage was inextricably linked to the sacred duty of childbearing, a relentless expectation that shaped their lives from a young age. And for many, the journey of life continued through the challenging and often precarious path of widowhood and remarriage, a cycle of loss and new beginnings. The expectation of childbirth loomed immediately after marriage, a pervasive and undeniable force in a woman's life, shaping her daily routines and her future. Fertility was not merely a blessing, it was considered tangible proof of a woman's worth and purpose, a divine mission bestowed upon her by God. A household without children was perceived as a house without a future, a lineage doomed to extinction. A womb that did not yield offspring was a cause for deep concern, pity, and fervent prayer, and sometimes even replacement through annulment or a new marriage for the husband. Women were expected to bear as many children as their bodies could allow, with noble women typically experiencing between 4 and 8 pregnancies in their lifetime, a grueling and often dangerous cycle. Sons were particularly desired, especially among the nobility, to ensure the continuation of the family lineage, secure inheritances, and solidify political alliances. The pressure to produce male heirs was immense, as the absence of a son could lead to dynastic instability, the fragmentation of lands, and even conflict as rival claimants emerged. The future of the family, and sometimes the kingdom, rested on the birth of a male child. Infertility was a pervasive and huge problem in medieval Europe, with profound social and personal consequences for those affected. It was most often blamed on women, who were stigmatized as defective and subjected to various forms of social criticism and disadvantage, seen as failing in their most fundamental duty. Infertility could lead to the confiscation of a woman's inheritance by her lord, or, in extreme cases, even the nullification of her marriage, leaving her without status or support. Religious interpretations often framed infertility as a punishment from God for sin, or even as the malevolent work of devils or witches, adding a layer of spiritual condemnation to the physical condition. Faced with such immense pressure and stigma, women and couples resorted to desperate measures and rudimentary treatments to encourage conception, often based on superstition rather than science. These included bizarre concoctions like ground pig testicles sprinkled in wine, believed to enhance virility, catnip-infused wine, or a worm test, involving urine left in a pot for days to determine fertility based on the presence of worms. Despite the prevailing tendency to blame women, the 12th century Trotula text, a significant medical compendium written by women, surprisingly acknowledged that conception is impeded as much by the fault of the man as by the fault of the women, a rare and progressive understanding of male infertility. This nuanced understanding of male infertility was also recognised in medieval marriage law, where it could be grounds for annulment, offering a small measure of relief for some women. The intense societal pressure for women to bear children, particularly male heirs, meant that fertility was not just a biological function but a critical social and economic imperative. The blame for infertility falling predominantly on women, despite some medical texts acknowledging male factors, highlights a deeply ingrained patriarchal bias of the era. This pressure, combined with the rudimentary and often bizarre treatments, created a profound emotional and physical burden on medieval women, tying their worth and security directly to their reproductive success. Their bodies became a battleground of hope, fear, and societal expectation, underscoring the relentless demands placed upon them to ensure the continuity of family and lineage, a heavy burden to bear. Childbirth in 1100 was an inherently perilous undertaking, a leading cause of female deaths in the medieval period. Historical records indicate that more than 1 in 3 women died during their childbearing years due to birth or its complications, a stark and terrifying reality that overshadowed every pregnancy. This grim statistic meant that expectant mothers lived with a pervasive sense of fear and anxiety, knowing that each labour could be their last. Many women, anticipating the worst, would even write their wills before going into labour, making preparations for their potential demise. Childbirth was largely a secluded affair, from which men were generally excluded, unless the circumstances were exceptional or the child was of royal lineage, where the presence of witnesses was required for legitimacy. The birthing chamber, particularly for upper-class women, was often kept dark, quiet, and scented with purifying herbs like juniper or rosemary, designed to be an external recreation of the womb to ensure a safe and smooth transition for the child. Midwives, usually illiterate and from the lower classes, were the primary attendants, relying on oral tradition, practical experience, knowledge of herbs, and basic tools like birthing stools to assist the labouring woman. In the absence of modern medical interventions, women and their attendants relied heavily on a blend of religious rituals and folk superstitions to ensure a safe delivery and to influence the outcome. Symbolic barriers to the womb opening were removed. Cupboard doors were opened, knots untied from clothing or hair, and hairpins removed, all believed symbolically ease the passage of the child. Women might wear gemstones on a girdle such as amber or jasper, believed to have protective or pain-relieving properties, or use birth girdles, strips of parchment inscribed with prayers and charms, wrapped around their bodies, invoking divine or magical aid. Amulets and charms might be placed on the stomach to speed contractions. Prayers to saints, particularly Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, were common, her intercession fervently sought. The intense pain of labour was often framed as a natural part of childbirth, a consequence of Eve's original sin, a divine punishment for humanity's fall. Despite the physical and emotional toll, a woman was expected to return to her household duties within days of giving birth, or even sooner if her family was poor, her body still recovering from the immense strain, yet her labour still required. Childbirth in 1100 was a profoundly vulnerable and often terrifying experience for women, a stark reminder of life's fragility and the constant presence of death. The reliance on female-centric networks, such as midwives and female relatives, and a blend of religious rituals and folk remedies highlights the limited medical knowledge and the absence of modern intervention. These practices, while seemingly unscientific by today's standards, offered crucial psychological comfort and a sense of agency in a situation largely beyond their control. The expectation of quick recovery and immediate return to duties further underscores the relentless demands placed on women, even in the face of immense physical and emotional trauma, revealing a societal imperative to maintain productivity regardless of personal suffering. Their bodies were not entirely their own, but instruments of lineage and survival. In the year 1100, widowhood was rarely an ending. It was more often a pause, frequently a very brief one, in the continuous flow of life. Given the high mortality rates of the era, young husbands died often, succumbing to war, illness, accidents, or even malice. It was not uncommon for a girl who married at 12 to be widowed by 13, and then betrothed again, before she could even fully remember the name of her first husband. Such was the relentless pace of life and death. Despite the sorrow of loss, a young widow still held significant value in medieval society. Her dowry had already been invested in her first marriage, establishing a financial foundation, and her fertility was either proven if she had children or presumed if she was still young, making her a desirable match for new alliances. If she had not yet had children from her first union, she could be married off again without complex inheritance complications, a clean slate for a new family. If she had a child, particularly a son, she might be retained within the deceased husband's household as a maternal guardian or steward until the boy reached maturity, after which she might remarry or recede into a supporting role. Remarriage was common and often actively encouraged, particularly if she had children to feed or land to tend, as it provided crucial economic stability and protection in a precarious world where a woman alone was vulnerable. Widows, especially noble ones, held a unique and sometimes more autonomous position in medieval society compared to unmarried daughters or married women. While alive, a married woman's property was largely controlled by her husband under the custom of coverture, where her legal identity was subsumed by his. However, upon widowhood, a woman could gain a degree of legal and economic independence. She was entitled to a dower, typically 1/3 of her deceased husband's land, which she could hold for her lifetime or until remarriage. This meant she could manage her own property, make decisions about her household, and even act as a legal representative in court, a level of autonomy rarely afforded to other women in this patriarchal society. However, this newfound freedom was often fragile and conditional. It frequently lasted only until someone stronger, richer, or more connected decided otherwise, seeing her dower lands or her proven fertility as a valuable asset. Widows might be compelled to remarry, particularly if their property was desirable or if the family needed to reinforce alliances, their personal wishes secondary to dynastic or economic needs. They could also face significant fines or even forfeiture of their dower if they remarried without permission, especially from the crown or their feudal lord, who had a vested interest in controlling such valuable assets. Widowhood in 1100 thus presented a unique, albeit often temporary, shift in a woman's status. While it could grant her unprecedented legal and economic autonomy, particularly in property management, this freedom was constantly under threat from family, feudal lords, or the crown, who viewed her as a valuable asset to be rematched for their own interests. This created a compelling narrative of a woman navigating a precarious balance between personal agency and societal expectation, where her reset into a new marital status was often dictated by external forces rather than her own desires. Despite the potential for increased independence, the pressure to remarry often remained strong, transforming her from a grieving individual into an available asset once more, her life a continuous negotiation of circumstances. As the candle flickers low and the echoes of the past begin to soften, we reflect on the intricate tapestry of medieval women's lives in the year 1100. Their stories, whether noble or peasant, were woven with threads of duty, pragmatism, and an enduring resilience in a world that offered them little personal choice in marriage. Their lives were not their own to command, but they found ways to navigate the currents of their time, leaving behind a legacy of quiet strength. The lives of medieval women, from the grand halls of castles to the humble village hearths, are profound tales of adaptation and resilience. Their futures were largely predetermined by the strategic needs of their families and the rigid structures of society, their paths laid out before them. Yet, within these constraints, they found ways to exist, to remember, and to survive. Noble women, though powerful in their administrative roles, navigated a paradox of responsibility and limited personal autonomy, their lives a constant performance under scrutiny, every move observed. Peasant women, bound by the relentless rhythms of agricultural labour, found strength in their practical skills and the deep interdependence of their communities, their survival a collective endeavour. Across both social strata, common experiences emerged. The immense pressure to marry and bear children, particularly male heirs, which tied a woman's worth directly to her reproductive success, a fundamental measure of her value. The perilous reality of childbirth, a leading cause of death, forced women to rely on networks of female support, faith, and folk medicine to navigate a terrifying passage, their bodies enduring immense strain. Even in widowhood, a period that offered a fleeting glimpse of legal and economic independence, women often found themselves caught between newfound autonomy and societal pressures to remarry, highlighting a precarious balance between personal agency and external forces, their freedom often conditional. The distinctions between noble and peasant women were stark in material terms, from the luxurious silks of the castle to the rough wool of the hut, and in the scale of their marriage negotiations. Yet, beneath these differences lay shared human experiences, the quiet moments of affection that blossomed in arranged unions, the vulnerability exposed by clandestine vows, and the bold, albeit risky, acts of elopement that spoke to an enduring human desire for choice and love, a yearning for self-determination. The past does not need to shout to be heard, it only needs to whisper. And in these whispers, we hear the quiet strength of women who, in a world that often treated them as signatures waiting to be assigned to contracts, found profound ways to shape their stories. Their journeys, though centuries removed, remind us of the enduring human spirit that navigates life's grand designs and its hidden stitches, finding a way to make the story their own, even if only in silence, even if only in dreams. Now, let the story quiet itself. Let the footsteps fade. Let the ribbons slip through your fingers. The loom is still. The thread is at rest. The vows have been said. The baby is breathing evenly in the cradle. The wedding candles have burned down. The stew has cooled. There is nothing left to prepare. You may rest now too. You are not being measured. You are not being matched. You are not being watched. Only held. Just for a little while. Until morning. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with the Midnight Historian. If tonight's story helped you find calm, please consider subscribing to join us again under the stars. Leave a like or a gentle comment. It helps these peaceful tales reach others who need rest. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and let the echoes of the past lull you into peace.